Our next panel this morning has been assembled by Simpson Grierson, and is going to take a closer look at what is required for delivering the future of renewables in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, to introduce our panellists, I will welcome the facilitator for this session, Simpson Grierson partner Simon Vanini.
Kia ora koutou, ko Simon Vanini toka ringoa. I'm a commercial partner at Simpson Grierson's Tamaki Makaurau office, specialising, unsurprisingly, in large infrastructure projects, mergers and acquisitions, and dealing with difficult clients, none of whom are here today. So look, the purpose of today's session, I think, really builds quite nicely on the discussions that have been had over the conference so far. We all recognise we need to move towards carbon zero. We need to take into account how we're going to achieve these things, but importantly, we also need to deal with the fact that we are going to have increased need for electricity over the next few years as we all get our electric cars and electric lawnmowers and everything else. So it was, some of the slides we just saw in the last session were really interesting around, we already have a very high level of renewable electricity, but we're going to need a lot more. And the way we're going to achieve that is through very large projects. Now, the big issue, of course, around large projects is they take a long time, they're complex, they're very expensive, and it's important we get started now. We have to get started now because we've got some really tight timeframes within which we want to start to achieve some of these climate outcomes. So what we thought would be helpful for the panel today is, rather than listening to someone like me, listening to some people who are actually on the ground, trying to get these projects underway, trying to finance them, trying to plan for them. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists, and then we've got a few questions that I'll seed for a bit of a discussion. And then obviously I've got this little pad here, which some questions will hopefully come through from the audience. But before I get started, obviously it's very important to do your disclosures of interest. So I do hold shares in Auckland Airport in my own name, and I have no intention of selling them. But look, just to start introducing my fellow panellists here today. So just to my immediate left, Nathan Turner. Nathan's the country manager at Blue Float Energy. So after starting his career as a lawyer, he saw the light and has been working in the energy sector for the last 12 years or so. He came across to New Zealand and joined Blue Float as the country manager, and he's obviously looking to start seeding some of these large offshore wind projects and other things, so it's great to have Nathan on board with us. Next to Nathan is Gary Holden, who's the Managing Director of Lodestone Solar. So a number of you will know Lodestone. They're currently rolling out 5 large grid-scale solar farms from Northland down to the Bay of Plenty, so a very significant, and I think just a real show that we can create very large projects and get them underway. So it's great to have Gary here. Gary's got over 30 years in the energy industry and will bend your ear any time on what's right and wrong about it. So thanks, Gary. Next to Gary, Judy Nichols, CEO of Counties Energy. So Counties is an electricity distribution network based out of Pukekohe, which serves sort of South Auckland down to north of Waikato. A very forward-thinking organisation looking at how technology and other things can help it deal with the fact that everyone's wanting to connect onto their network with all sorts of different renewable generation technologies, and also themselves, they are looking to build a wind farm, and they've got 4 wind farms already connected at various sizes to their network, so it's an interesting time for them as well. And finally, down the far end, Brendan Mahood, who's a director of the project finance team at ANZ Institutional Banking. Brendan's had over 10 years experience in this area in terms of project finance, leverage finance and resources, energy and infrastructure, and is responsible for driving ANZ's renewable energy strategy in New Zealand. So look, what I thought we'd start with is looking at the financing aspect, because that is the bit that really, talking to people over the last sort of day and a half, it's the bit people are really struggling with, which is how do we make sure these large infrastructure projects actually add up? Can we get the business case together? There's a whole lot of uncertainty, what's really important. So I thought I'd throw it over to Brendan first, just to give us a bit of insight from a funder's perspective. What are the kinds of things you're looking for these large, I guess, game-changing infrastructure projects?
Tēnā koutou katoa, and thanks very much for having me here today. So I think there's obviously sort of numerous things that we look at when it comes to these types of investment, but it's also sort of important to step back and sort of look at the macro scale and the type of investments that are coming through. So I think what we've seen probably in the last decade as sort of a relative period of sort of dormancy in the development of some of these renewables that is really in sort of the last few years is just really starting to sort of exponentially ramp up from what we're seeing. And so, we've seen sort of, a couple of reports in the last year or so which have set out, and we've discussed these sort of a little bit over the last couple of days about the scale of the investment that's required. The Electricity Authority sort of spoke about 37 billion which needs to be spent by 2050 on generation. The BCG report talks about $42 billion of investment over the next decade in the electricity sector. So what you're seeing is there's, it's really wide-scale investment across the entire sector, but really across that whole energy system as well. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of that growth that will be coming through in terms of the generation. So and it's not necessarily always sort of the areas of investment that you might be expecting to see. We talk a lot about the sort of the new generation that's coming on, that needs to come online, but it's also certain other areas which that we probably potentially need to talk a little bit more about. So transmission and distribution. Obviously, that number's talked about it being $30 billion, which is, just an absolutely huge number, really. 3 times the amount of generation that needs to be spent in the next decade. So, and then we talk about sort of the level of generation spend that's required. I think Nathan was on the video last night talking about sort of a potential of 500 megawatts that needs to be sort of developed per annum. There's, we've heard of sort of around about 2% in the electricity supply which needs to be built. So, or potentially a new Clyde Dam every year from here on in. So there's a broad range of investments that are really sort of coming to market and need to be funded and need financing. And we've seen a real sort of step up, I guess, in particular from some of the gentailers in the last sort of recent years. And they're not all sort of funded or financed in the same way as well. So, we've seen the use of sort of corporate debt, and we've seen the use of the equity capital markets playing an important part in that as well. So I guess just at a really high level, and if we are sort of looking at the funding of sort of generation projects, there's probably, just summarising 4 sort of, in particular key areas that we would be looking at for some of these transactions. The first would be sponsor. So, obviously it's it's important to have a sponsor that's hopefully got a track record and got sort of a high degree of experience in terms of what they're investing in. Construction risk has become sort of a more and more important element in a number of these transactions. And we've experienced on a number of our projects in the last few years sort of delays and cost escalations, and so that is certainly something that we look at very closely for a number of funding these renewables projects. A lot of the technology and the new investment is in slightly new areas in New Zealand. So Gary's sort of solar development, there's not a huge amount of utility scale solar in New Zealand at the moment, but that's starting to come online, and so you're seeing some new construction parties enter into the New Zealand market for that as well. The electricity hedging is also a very important part of these transactions, and typically for sort of funding of new renewables, you might see slightly higher sort of debt levels and transactions that have a higher level of electricity hedging or offtake for the transactions. So I think we might be sort of talking a little bit about that sort of later today, but that's sort of a market that's really starting to sort of slowly build and get a little bit of momentum in New Zealand. And then I guess the final one is probably just technology, and I alluded to earlier that we are seeing sort of a range of new technologies coming into the New Zealand market. Offshore wind, obviously, we've talked about just previously about sort of electrolyzers, and there's obviously battery energy storage solutions being talked about. So, understanding and recognising the risks of some of those new technologies is something that we look at for these transactions very closely as well.
Yeah, and I think some of those associated investments, as you say, around whether it's EV charging software or grid-scale batteries or other things that are, they're complementary, they need to be part of our overall model. I'm interested in hearing from you, Gary, in terms of someone who's had to go through the process of getting debt and equity to support a very large project. So maybe just talk us through some lessons from that.
Yeah, we decided to go down a path of raising equity in the New Zealand market only at this point. So we went through a period of raising capital essentially to buy land and pay for engineering of 5 solar farms through just bilateral equity raises with high net worth individuals in the country, and 25 people stepped up to get us the first $45 million of capital. The second phase was more of a traditional raise process. We went out to the market and brought in new investors like Jarden Principal Investments and ACC and Purpose Capital, and so the second phase was built on the back of the fact that we had acquired the land, done the engineering, put together the EPC contract, and sold essentially the output from 5 farms into the market. And then probably the most important part was getting some debt financing, and Westpac was there for us and came up with a very innovative structure to phase 5 projects, and between those equity tranches and the debt, we're off and running and building 5 projects. The most difficult thing probably in that whole process is kind of recognizing that most of the world has built solar power on the back of government RFPs or high credit offtakes through renewable energy programs, and New Zealand being dedicated to sticking to a pure market where the government steps aside. The challenge for any solar developer is to figure out how you replace the credit quality of a government with market, and our belief is, in the long run, the way to do that is to have a very diverse set of customers, have the credit spread over diversity, and through that diversity you end up with a very solid backing of offtake. And so we're continuing down that path. That's our plan. We're taking about 1/3 of our output into the mass market. We're taking a 1/3 of the output into the small commercial market, and about 1/3 into what I would call sort of the large direct customer market. And by creating that diversity, we can nearly simulate the credit quality of what other countries have been able to achieve through selling to governments, and it's working well. And I think that the beautiful thing about that is, we see the growth in electricity coming from just population growth, electrification of the market, and replacement of fossil fuel. Those components together mean that there's going to be quite a lot of solar and wind built, and offshore I think will be a big part of that in the long run too. And it's the matching of that sort of diverse market and the multiple of projects is kind of the art form, and it looks very promising. There's 8,000 projects proposed, and we probably only need about 8,000 megawatts of projects proposed, and we only need 2 or 3. So there's definitely an oversupply of ideas. It's now just figuring out how do you high grade those, get the best business plans to surface to the top.
Yeah, look, and I think, the first thing I take out of that, Gary, is obviously starting to be a level of sophistication from customers as well. Large businesses, medium-sized businesses saying, I can enter some arrangements with someone like Lodestone where I can be actually taking electricity in a way that we're comfortable with, that we can say is being generated through solar. I think, creating some more sophistication around how these things are funded. It's not just all through, a large equity funder or a large debt funder. There's a bit of a combination. So I think that's a great model. What it does bring us to, obviously, is one of the biggest challenges, the regulatory environment. And I think that's for everything, whether it's resource consenting, whether it's, looking at the electricity industry itself. So those of you who were at the dinner last night would have seen Nathan talking already about, I guess, his views around the situation for offshore wind. And so I'd invite Nathan to talk a little bit about the regulatory regime we're going to need in New Zealand. As a number of you will be aware, MB is currently consulting on some legislation and associated regulations that are intended to come into force next year around offshore wind. And obviously that's going to be a key building block in terms of organisations like Nathan's putting together business cases for these large, expensive, complex projects. So just a few thoughts from you, please, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So I guess first thing I would say is that there is a huge amount of investment to be made in this space in the coming decades, and absolutely local investors will be really important. But given the scale of some of the projects, I think attracting international capital will also be really important. To give you a sense, a gigawatt scale offshore wind farm is a multi-billion-dollar CapEx investment. But for any international investor, you're obviously, I guess, assessing a pipeline of opportunities in different jurisdictions. And you're looking at things like the quality of the resource, the market conditions, but regulatory and policy certainty, I think is one of those really key elements to attract international capital to this space. You mentioned that the government is currently consulting on a regulatory framework for offshore renewables, which we expect next year, and I think we're really encouraged by the progress that the government's making in that space. But I think I'd also say that we're generally kind of operating in a pretty uncertain energy landscape in New Zealand at the moment, in the sense that not only are we waiting for a regulatory framework next year for offshore renewables, but end of 2024 we're waiting for an energy strategy, end of 2024 we're waiting for a hydrogen roadmap. Is TY staying or going? Is the battery project happening or not? Is the RMA staying or going? I think all of these factors are creating a level of uncertainty which is stymieing investment in renewable energy at a time when we really need to be accelerating and getting ahead. And if I reflect on the earlier presentation, talking about some of the actions that are being taken in other countries to encourage investment in energy, where I think some countries are seeing the opportunity to use energy as a tool to stimulate broader economic development, etc. The IRA in the States, various initiatives in Australia. Those countries are now seeing a flood of international capital coming at them to invest in renewables, to help their economies transition and promote broader economic growth. And I think if New Zealand kind of sits in this policy black hole for 18 months, we're potentially going to see either a lack of new investors coming or maybe some investors actually leaving at a time when we really need to be putting our foot on the gas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we do need to continue to be open to overseas capital. We need to make it easy for people. I think, we've been advising, through some overseas law firms. We get sent a table saying, can you fill us out for the regulatory environment in New Zealand for someone who wants to set up a solar business or whatever it happens to be. And we know that what they're doing is they're putting that in a big table and going, here are all the countries, here's the regulatory regime, is it open for business? What does that mean? What does the Overseas Investment Act mean for us in terms of investing overseas? And then they'll select, where they're going to go based on that analysis. So it's really important that analysis is very positive. I mean, we're not going to tick all the boxes, but it needs to be positive for us because we are in an international market for capital, but also more importantly, an international market for expertise, the people that are actually going to come over here, people like Nathan who are going to spend their time saying, look, I believe that this is the right place to build these things. So look, continuing with the regulatory theme, obviously at the other end, these things need to link up into electricity distribution businesses. They need to adapt. They are obviously very regulated, but they need to anticipate what's going to happen over the next few years as these different renewable energy projects come online. So an opportunity for Judy to talk about it from the customer end. Judy.
Kia ora, Simon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak from the utilities perspective, part of the infrastructure puzzle. So future customers are a passion for us, and we spend a lot of time imagining energy, reimagining energy, and thinking about what future customers, what lives and what role we have to be informed by and to inform those future lives. So future customers will have greater choice, there's no doubt about it, and greater choice than currently or historically has been the case. So historically our energy system, to use a very crude analysis, has been a kind of one size fits all, and the groupings we've had have been around residential, commercial and industrial groupings, not by customer appetite or ability to resource renewable options, and that's going to change, and it is changing. So new energy, which is looking at the use of renewable generation at a commercial and residential level for this discussion will fundamentally change the way we have to operate as a network as we cater for those customers. And our mindset has to change into, I was interested in what Ning said earlier around the need to look at the customer mindset and make those adjustments. We're very much in that space. So our customer research team set about saying, what does that mean in terms of understanding what those future customers will want? We identified 5 personality groups around renewable energy, around climate sustainability, and the first of that was about 40% of the customers' research, which was a group we called Money-Wise, and they are very much aware of where they can find savings, what they can do. They are cost aware and they make adjustments accordingly. About 20% of our customer base was what we call quick wins. These are people who know they can do better. They are time poor, and their message to us was, we want to do something, we don't have time to sort it, just tell us what to do or do it for us and we're on board, but don't ask us to take time. There's a 20% of the customer base which we call genuinely green, who go, actually, we've made lifestyle choices because we're fully committed. It can be a bit of a hassle, but it's worth it because we believe. 10% were technical savvy or tech savvy, and that's give us the gadgets, we'll control our homes, we'll control everything. The more data, the more use of technology, the better. And sadly or disturbingly, 10% were the comfort and convenience, who said, we'll just use energy whenever we want. We don't really have any care or any sort of buy into this bigger picture, and we just use whatever we want whenever. So when we look at starting to work with those groups and working who's looking to us for leadership and who we are looking to for leadership, that's important as we partner together into a different way of using energy. And we need to, and whether these customers, whether it's through electric vehicle chargers, solar, wind, smart appliances, batteries, whatever it is very much changing how they want to connect to the network, because renewable energy, I'm not getting into the technology of that, but from a customer perspective, there is a requirement for the distribution network to be able to provide those choices and to be responsive. We're also aware that there are customers who are knowledge poor, time poor, and resource poor, and for whom choice is a very different option, and we have to manage the network differently for those customers. So in summary, for our approach to that, just to cut to the chase, we're very much looking at a model called the DSO model, a distribution system operator model, which in simple terms provides a method, a model for us to be an orchestrator of energy across our communities and our customers, or a spider web that connects renewable energy and connects customers to the network. So it changes the status quo, it changes the way we operate, and again, to quote Ning, it is our roadmap to get there.
Great. Thanks, Judy. Look, I think another thing that we've been thinking about is the challenges around the global market that we're facing for getting the equipment we need as well as the expertise. But I think equipment in particular is key, because it just reminded me of the debacle around getting rat tests. You know, New Zealand finally decided we might need some rat tests and found out we were at the back of the queue. And I think there's a little bit of a danger for us as well. If we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about doing projects and planning for planning and those kinds of things, we are going to end up at the end of the queue in terms of getting the equipment, getting things manufactured and delivered into New Zealand in time to deliver our projects. So, Gary, you're the one with the most experience in trying to get things into the country. So maybe tell us a bit about some of the challenges you faced and how you think we could possibly make that work a bit better.
Well, look, putting together projects like these is quite a lot of intense work by a lot of people. Just to give you some example, or give you some sense of that, to put together this first portfolio of 5 projects, we've negotiated something like 35 different bilateral contracts that at least 50% of them had never been done before. We're dealing with 27 companies providing services to these 5 farms. We've probably got 20 counterparties in those 35 contracts, but each one of those counterparties has not necessarily the same general incentives as we would have, and so there's a lot of encouragement needed and give and take across that entire spectrum. And to be able to do that in a time frame where consenting time frames are probably about a year, the interconnection capacity is sort of reserved and put on hold for about a year, and all of those issues have to be sorted simultaneously within that time frame. And so it is to imagine, there's going to be so many projects that fail just because we don't need all the projects that are proposed, but most of them will fall over just because it's such a complex process to do it in a free market where you're not just negotiating with the government. And so, it's not for the faint of heart, but I think the good news in all that is it is doable. We're proving that you can do it, and it just takes money and time and effort and a whole lot of experience. And I'm very encouraged personally that we'll meet 100% renewable energy by 2030. I have no concern about meeting that target, because I think once we get into this mode where there are a number of players we've kind of broken the ice, and now there's probably going to be a much smoother path for others, then it looks very, very much like the economics are right. The market's willing to purchase the product from these technologies, and it looks like the equity and debt markets are right behind it. So I'm very, very encouraged by it all.
Yeah, and I guess just for you, Nathan, one of the ways of, I think, dealing with this is partnering up with large international organisations and people who have got experience, people who have got networks who can bring the equipment, bring the expertise into the country as needed. And I guess that's one of the strengths you'd say your organisation's got.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, being able to sort of point to an international pipeline and maybe sort of global strategic relationships with suppliers is helpful. Investment in the wind space globally has exploded. There's kind of 3 big OEMs which supply most of the products, and they're all operating at capacity today. And so if you're turning up with a 300 megawatt project on the other side of the world and trying to compete with someone building maybe a 2 gigawatt project in the UK, it's probably quite difficult to gain their attention. So I think having those sort of strategic global relationships with those key suppliers is really important. But again, there are other things that as a country we can be doing to make sure we remain relevant in these global supply chains. And long-term targets for renewable energy is one mechanism that other governments have used. And I think particularly in the offshore wind space, we see a number of countries coming out making sort of explicit promises around we're targeting X gigawatts by 2030, Y gigawatts by 2040, Z gigawatts by 2050. And so not only does that make your country very relevant for international suppliers, but I think it plays a really important role in stimulating local supply chains, which is super important from a sort of broader economic development perspective from New Zealand. We can kind of assume that we'll just import these components forever, and a lot of those profits and jobs, etc., will end up remaining overseas. But if we really want to encourage local businesses to get into the manufacture or fabrication of some of these components, then we need to be laying out, a future for them, because they might need to invest in some new workforce, a new piece of kit, some new property. If they can only see one project on the horizon that they're supplying, they're probably never going to do it. But if they can see a 20-year pipeline of projects that they can earn a return on capital for, then we're just going to stimulate so much more economic activity in this country. All that trickle-down sort of benefit, the jobs, etc., will have a really positive, broader impact other than just decarbonisation.
Yeah, it's definitely a massive opportunity. I was going to talk a little bit about the government's role, and we'll come on to that at the moment, but as we've seen in the last day and a half, the government is giving us everything we want, so we probably don't need to discuss that anymore. They've given us a list. But maybe down to Brendan again. One of the big parts of these kinds of projects is the offtake arrangements, and we've touched on this a little bit. Do you think there's a role for government in actually leading some of that and encouraging, I guess, a really positive approach to saying, we're going to step into this market, we're going to make sure that, because they're very large projects, there's a huge amount of electricity being generated. How do you think the government could help make that work?
It's a really interesting question, that one, and something that we've seen in the power purchase agreement market in New Zealand is it's typically it's been very sort of underdeveloped relative to international markets, and it's not something that we've seen a lot of in New Zealand. And it's certainly something which is, plays a very important role internationally. we've seen in the Australian market, and it is a real sort of driver and underpins the ability to finance a number of these renewable projects. But that's really sort of been changing, I would say, in probably the last 12 months. We've seen a number of announcements and quite a big sort of pickup in PPA activity. We've seen Solar Bay announce their PPA sleeve with Mercury and Ryman. Contact Energy have also announced a number of PPA contracts recently, including sort of a 10-year one with Microsoft and also with New Zealand Steel. So you're starting to see sort of a steady flow, and that's in the private market, not sort of the government market, in terms of who's sort of contracting those. So I think it is still in the early stage of the development of that in the New Zealand market. I think we've got a lot more to come. And from what we sort of see in the market, we're starting to see, you know, a lot of those early stage discussions and almost more sort of reverse inquiries as well from corporates in New Zealand about entering into these power purchase agreements. So I think it is something we're going to see a lot more of. But, you know, what is the level and the depth of the New Zealand market in terms of corporate PPAs and how far can that go? I think that's kind of an unknown question at this point. And, you know, do you need the government to step in at a future point in time, maybe in a few years, if that PPA market does get sort of largely exhausted by the corporates? Is something that's really going to be an interesting question if we are to meet our climate change goals.
Yeah, and I think this is another part of, you know, we do need to invest ahead. I mean, one of the comments that Nathan made to me when we were planning for this session was around there's a huge amount of supporting infrastructure that needs to be put in place, whether that's port upgrades, obviously transmission grid upgrades, people like Judy expanding everywhere to try and meet demand. But look, what I thought I'd do is just we've got a couple of questions here. I mean, obviously I've been using this mainly to check the price of the Auckland Airport shares. It's looking good, you'll be pleased to know. But in terms of engagement with iwi and mana whenua, and I guess I just open this up to the panel, I mean, this is a really key part, and it's something that's probably, whilst not unique to New Zealand, I think it is such an important part of our ability to deliver these large projects which do have impacts. You know, they do have visual impacts, they do have environmental impacts, all those kind of things. So there's always a trade-off. But I think bringing people along, bring the communities along, bring the mana whenua, iwi along and everything is a really important part of it. So I guess interested, maybe Gary as a starter, just a few thoughts on that and how you've sort of managed that.
Oh, it's essential to factor that part of the culture and country into your business plans. One of the great things about solar farms is you tend to scatter them around the place. They tend to be in more extreme locations. You tend to, you know, be attached to smaller towns. That almost by definition means you're making pretty intense contact with all of the local people, including iwi. We found we've gotten tremendous traction with getting support quickly by kind of how we build a farm. One of the features is we're keeping the farm as a productive farm underneath the solar panels, and so that has a high degree of local appeal. But maybe more importantly, we're laying the groundwork to be able to sell the electricity from those farms to the local people. And so using normal retail marketing strategies to promote the idea that people in that area, iwi included, can sign up their electricity contract that they normally would buy from someone else with the local solar farm. And that kind of binds this idea that distribution of energy is smart. Everyone has a sense of that, but it also creates some physical contact. As they drive by the farm, they can say, hey, that's where I get my electricity from. And you can see that taking off in all corners of the country.
Yeah, and Judy, I guess, as a community-owned business, it's even more important for you to get that community buy-in for all the things that are happening. And again, a lot of the time, it's not necessarily you who's driving the project in your community, but you're seen as being intimately involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely, and we have a responsibility to learn from kaitiakitangi principles, and a lot of the lines companies are doing quite innovative work around solar, installing solar on marae, and actually working with local iwi around different ways of looking at energy. But yes, we absolutely have to work in with the community. We are community owned, which is a privilege, and how we operate and manage that's very important.
Yeah, and maybe the final word on this to Nathan, given, in some ways offshore wind is good because you can't see it unless you're out there, but actually there are a whole lot of issues that, starting to get my head around myself around what is the impact on the marine environment and other things. And again, the great thing is we've got some examples overseas that have been there for years and years. So, you do have something to look at, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think as a new industry for New Zealand, the obligation is on us to educate and provide information about both the risks and the opportunities that these projects pose. But absolutely the environmental impacts in the offshore space are really important. Offshore wind has been operating in Northern Europe for 30 years or more now, and so increasingly we're seeing studies and data available demonstrating the actual impact on seabird species, marine mammals, etc. We will of course need to go through a very thorough environmental baseline monitoring program and environmental impact assessment as part of the development of our projects, but being able to draw on some of those overseas examples already to point to observed impacts from years of operation, I think is really, really valuable. And like I said, the onus is on us to provide that information and education where we can.
Great. I guess just a final point on financing. Again, back to you, Brendan. I guess I'm interested in, we're seeing a lot more focus on, green bonds and green investment and things like that. So it's kind of at that end. I mean, are you seeing that as a real demand from people saying we want these investment opportunities as well? Whether it's corporates or, large business entities. I mean, that is a real opportunity, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. And I think, a huge number of these transactions that we're seeing now, it's almost, the question becomes if it's not sort of a green, sustainable loan, or it's not sort of a use of proceeds, then, it's almost reversed now. It's almost then, why isn't it, I guess? So, seeing huge growth across the board in that space. And, I think that's only something that we're just going to see more and more of as we go on. So, yeah, certainly much increasing focus in that space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Another question I had here was just around, it's probably aimed at Nathan, around, I guess, one of the issues with the large capacity of these offshore networks. Is there a danger that will crowd out some other projects, or the potential of these coming on board in 5 or 6 years might make people think again about doing some other projects which might come to market a lot quicker?
I think a valid concern, but I guess my answer would be I hope not. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that if electricity demand in New Zealand only continues to grow by 100 megawatts a year or something like that, we probably don't need to be building gigawatt scale offshore wind farms in this country in the next decade or two. But I guess we're really doing the work now to get ready for a future in which New Zealand takes a much more sort of aggressive pathway to decarbonisation. We've heard the 500 megawatt a year number a couple of times already today. But if you layer on top of that the kind of green ammonia, green hydrogen, green methanol opportunity, Transpower not that long ago released a power forecast of what that would do to power demand in this country before you even think about an export scenario. And so you go from about 40 terawatt hours today to about 80 terawatt hours by electrifying just the easy stuff. You can then add another 80 terawatt hours a year on top of that if we're going to decarbonise the hard-to-abate sectors in this country. So you pretty quickly go from needing 500 megawatts a year to more like a gigawatt or a gigawatt and a half a year if we're going to decarbonise heavy transport, heavy industry, etc. And so, in a world where electricity demand is growing that quickly, I would say that there's more than enough space for lots and lots of onshore renewable projects to be built, complemented by a handful of large gigawatt scale offshore projects as well, in those strategic locations that are either close to existing demand centres or close to where some of these electrolysers or other power-to-X opportunities might turn up.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. I mean, demand is only going to go one way and probably bigger than we all think it's going to be. And so we have to be prepared for that, and we have to build into the future. And I think that is one of the challenges, is building now for future demand, right, for all of us. So look, we've pretty much run out of time now. We have had a number of quite specific questions to members of the panel, so I'd encourage you all to approach them during the lunch break and hit them up with your questions. So look, it's just left to me now just to thank our panel very much. Appreciate you all giving us some quite practical insights, which I think is really important. And if you could all just show your appreciation. Thanks very much.